A 5-year-old girl was dragged into the yard right after her father's funeral. Her stepmother and her lover kept pouring cold water over her head, calling it washing away bad luck from a disabled child. She clutched her worn teddy bear, her small metal leg trembling on the freezing tiles, until a pickup truck stopped outside. A man in a soldier's jacket stepped out with his loyal German shepherd, placed his coat over her shoulders, and said one sentence that began a battle where cruelty would finally face justice. This is a haunting story about a soldier, his faithful dog, and their silent fight for justice for a little girl who had already suffered too much in this world. Stay with us, and let this story lead you through love, betrayal, and the unbreakable bond of loyalty. Now, let's begin. The afternoon sky hung low over Maple Ridge, a small town tucked between pine hills and whispering wind. The day after the funeral, the air still smelled faintly of rain and lilies, the kind used to cover graves. Inside the narrow yard of a modest brick house, the last trace of warmth had already drained away. A 5-year-old girl stood barefoot on the tiles, her left leg ending in a small metal prosthesis that caught the dim light like a mirror of her quiet pain. Her name was Emily. The child clutched an old teddy bear, its fur worn and matted, a keepsake from a mother who had died 3 years ago in a car accident, the same one that took her leg. Her father, Richard, had just been buried the day before after a long illness that had withered both his body and his fortune. And now, in the house that used to be his, something cruel was unfolding in the fading light. Marilyn, a woman in her mid-30s with perfect makeup and eyes sharp as ice, yanked Emily's small arm with a strength that betrayed impatience rather than grief. "Out!" she barked, dragging the girl across the threshold. Beside her stood Victor, a broad man with slicked hair and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He turned on the outdoor faucet, grabbed a hose, and the water began to hiss. "They say misfortune clings to the crippled," Marilyn said coldly, her voice slicing through the air. "Let's wash it off before it poisons the house." The first blast of freezing water struck Emily's shoulders, making her gasp. The stream hit her thin dress and soaked it instantly, clinging to her small frame as she stumbled, clutching the bear tighter, as if the toy could shield her from the cruelty that rained down. The water ran over her blonde hair until it stuck to her face in wet strands. Droplets rolled down her cheeks and mixed with tears that had never really stopped since the burial. Around them, the neighbors watched through half-drawn curtains, faces flickering behind glass, silent, pretending not to see. The sound of the hose was the only thing breaking the stillness of Maple Ridge that afternoon, a rhythmic, merciless hiss against tile and skin. Emily's small body shook from the cold, her metal legs slipping slightly against the slick floor. She didn't scream. She didn't know how to anymore. She simply looked down, clutching her bear, and whispered in a trembling voice that barely reached the air, "Daddy, where am I supposed to go now?" For a moment, everything seemed to stop, even the wind. And then, from the road beyond the gate, came the low hum of an approaching engine. The sound grew louder, echoing off the houses until it stopped abruptly before the yard. A dark green pickup truck sat behind the gate, its tires crunching against gravel. The door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his olive green field jacket marked with faint creases of long wear, his black baseball cap shadowing eyes that had seen too much of war. His name was Jack Carter, a veteran of Afghanistan, 42 years old, built like someone who carried both burdens and silence. At his side leapt Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle across his back and a tan chest and legs, his amber eyes sharp with quiet vigilance. A K-9 once trained to detect landmines, now retired, yet still every inch the guardian he had been trained to be. Jack froze for a heartbeat at the sight before him, a child drenched, trembling, and holding a soaked bear like it was the last thing keeping her alive. Something inside him shifted, a memory, a ghost, perhaps the echo of another time when no one had stepped in soon enough. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the misty air. Victor turned, annoyed, water still spraying from the hose. "Mind your business, old man." Jack kept walking, his boots heavy on the wet tiles. His tone was steady, but there was steel in it. If you're still human, you'll stop right now." He reached forward, snatched the hose from Victor's hand, and shut off the faucet in one motion. Water dripped from the nozzle, pooling at his boots. Victor straightened up, jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he hissed. Marilyn folded her arms, eyes darting between the soldier and the child. Jack didn't flinch. His gaze, cold and unwavering, pinned Victor like a rifle sight. "What I see," he said quietly, "is a man hurting a child. That's all I need to know." Rex moved in front of Emily, his fur bristling, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Not loud, not threatening, but enough to make Victor take a step back. The hose slipped from his hand, snaking across the tiles like a limp serpent. The sound of dripping water filled the silence again. Emily stared up at Jack, her lips trembling, her voice almost inaudible. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." Jack knelt down slowly, his shadow falling over her small form. "I know," he said softly, pulling his field jacket from his shoulders and wrapping it around her tiny frame. The heavy fabric swallowed her, the warmth soaking into her skin. Rex nudged closer, pressing his nose against her arm as if to assure her she was safe now. Jack glanced up at Marilyn, whose face was still taut with defiance. "If you think this is how you honor a man's death," he said, his tone turning low, "then you've already lost whatever soul you had left." The woman scoffed, but said nothing. Victor muttered something under his breath, stepping closer as though to intimidate. Jack's eyes met his, steady, unyielding, honed by years of looking into danger and not blinking. For a moment the air grew taut. Victor lifted his hand as if to shove him, but Rex's sudden bark, sharp, commanding, the kind only a trained K9 could produce, froze him mid-motion. The sound echoed through the street, scattering a few crows from the nearby pines. Jack didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any threat. Victor's arm dropped to his side, his eyes flickering with something between anger and fear. No one spoke for several seconds. The neighbors' curtains fluttered again. Someone whispered, "That's Jack Carter," before pulling away from the window. Marilyn's lip trembled, though she masked it with a forced sneer. "Take her then," she spat. "See if she brings you luck." Jack didn't answer. He bent down, slid his arms beneath the girl's frail body, and lifted her gently as though she were made of glass. Emily let out a small gasp, more from surprise than fear, and clung to the collar of his jacket. The bear hung from her fingers, dripping, until Rex carefully picked it up in his mouth and followed close behind. Jack turned toward the gate, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. He didn't look back. The pickup's door creaked open, and he set Emily inside, wrapping the seatbelt across her lap. Rex jumped in beside her, curling up to keep her warm. Jack closed the door quietly, then paused, glancing once more toward the house. Marilyn and Victor stood framed by the doorway, silhouettes against the dim light, watching in stunned silence. For a long second, no one moved, just the wind, tugging at the last drops of rain, and the soft hum of the truck's engine waiting to carry them away. As the pickup rolled down the empty road, its red taillights reflected on the wet pavement, glimmering like twin embers fading into the dusk. In the back seat, Emily leaned against Rex's fur, her eyes half closed, exhaustion overcoming the cold. The bear rested on her lap, its damp fabric slowly drying under the faint heat from the vents. Jack's face remained unreadable, fixed on the road ahead, yet behind that stillness was a silent promise that what began here, in this yard of cruelty, would not end in silence. The last image of Maple Ridge that day was of a trail of water leading from the house to the road, broken by small footprints and paw marks beside them. The hose lay abandoned in the yard, still dripping, like a snake that had lost its venom. And in that fading light, through the fog that gathered over the hills, the only thing that remained was the echo of a soldier's voice and the quiet breathing of a child who had just been given back the right to hope. The wind outside Silver Creek howled through the pine trees, brushing against the windows of a small mountain cabin that sat half hidden beneath the snow-dusted branches. Inside, the light from the old stone fireplace flickered softly against the walls, painting the room in hues of gold and shadow. Jack Carter sat near the hearth, his olive field jacket draped over a chair to dry, the faint scent of wet wool mingling with pine and smoke. Across from him, Emily sat on a thick wool blanket, wrapped in a quilt that nearly swallowed her small frame. Her hair, still damp from the rain, clung to her forehead in messy strands. Rex lay beside her, his black and tan coat glistening faintly in the firelight, eyes half closed, yet always alert, his tail thumping once each time the wind hit the door. The kettle hissed on the stove. Jack poured hot water into a chipped ceramic bowl, stirring in a mix of broth and vegetables until the scent filled the small space. "Eat slowly," he said quietly, setting the bowl and a spoon before her. Emily nodded but hesitated, her thin hands hovering over the bowl as if asking permission from ghosts unseen. She took one small spoonful, then stopped, eyes downcast. I don't want to make the house dirty," she whispered. Jack's voice softened, patient and steady. "You won't. This house isn't afraid of a little mess." She didn't reply, but after a long moment, she took another spoonful. The sound of the spoon against the bowl was almost lost in the fire's crackle. When she had eaten only a few mouthfuls, she set the spoon aside, her small shoulders curling inward. Jack leaned back, studying her carefully without pressing. Children who had learned fear at home never responded to comfort too quickly. Emily's gaze wandered toward the window, where the dark forest pressed against the glass, and in the reflection, her small face looked pale, fragile, and older than 5 years. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice faint, as though afraid the truth might hear her. "Daddy got sick." His heart stopped. Jack nodded, letting her words rest. But when she said heart, her eyes flinched, and she gripped the edge of the blanket tighter. The way she avoided his gaze told him there was more she wasn't ready to say. Rex lifted his head, watching her intently before nudging his nose under her small hand. Emily managed a tiny smile, rubbing his fur absent-mindedly. Outside, the storm had begun to fade, leaving behind only the sighing wind across the mountains. Jack stood, took the small teddy bear that sat drying near the fire, and inspected its frayed edges. The fur was worn thin, one ear nearly torn off. "You've had him a long time," Jack murmured. Emily nodded, her voice no louder than the rustle of the fire. "It was Mommy's last gift." He gave a faint nod, then set a small bucket beside the fireplace, dipping the bear gently into warm water to wash away the dirt. Rex shifted closer, ears twitching, watching his every move. As Jack wrung out the toy and set it on a towel to dry, Rex suddenly tilted his head, then moved toward it. The dog's paw lifted and brushed against the bear's ear, claws catching on a loose stitch. Jack frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" Rex let out a low whine and pawed again, tearing the fabric slightly wider. Something metallic glinted faintly beneath the seam. Jack leaned closer and carefully pulled at the fabric until a small silver USB stick slid out into his hand. It was no larger than his thumb, cold and spotless despite the worn cloth around it. He turned it over once in his palm before glancing at Emily, who was watching with wide, uncertain eyes. "Do you know what this is?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "It was always inside the bear," she murmured. "Daddy said never lose it." Jack set the USB on the table near the fire, his brows drawn together. He dried his hands, plugged the small drive into his old laptop, and waited as the screen flickered to life. Rex lay at his feet, ears pricked, eyes tracking every movement. A single file appeared on the screen. No name, no date, just a simple sound icon. Jack hesitated only a second before double-clicking it. The cabin filled with a burst of static, then the tremble of a man's voice, weary but unmistakably human. "Marilyn," it said, each syllable heavy with fatigue. "I don't need this medicine. Every time I take it, my heart races like it's trying to stop." A pause, then a softer voice, female, almost a whisper, sliding through the air like a knife. "Just drink it, darling. It will help you rest." "Nah, let him drink more," she added, her tone flattening into ice. The crackle of the recording continued. A glass clinked, footsteps crossed a wooden floor, then silence. Jack froze. The firelight danced across his face, carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. He hit pause, the sound cutting off abruptly. Emily looked at him, confused. "That's my dad, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Jack exhaled slowly, nodding once. He didn't answer the question that followed in her eyes, the one about the woman's voice. The truth was already too loud in the room. He unplugged the USB and stared at it as though it were a fragment of something sacred and poisonous at once. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint hum of the fire. Jack set the USB carefully into a small tin box and placed it on the mantel. Then he looked at Emily again, her face small and pale under the flicker of light, her eyes too knowing for a child. "Emily," he said gently, "when your father was sick, did anyone else stay in the house?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "Marilyn and her friend. He came every day after Daddy got worse." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her lips together to stop them from trembling. Jack nodded, leaning back in his chair. His gaze drifted to the window, where the snow outside had begun to fall again, silent and relentless. Rex lay down at Emily's feet, his tail curling around her small metal leg as if trying to keep it warm. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe across the walls. Jack's mind was no longer in that cabin. It was somewhere between duty and memory, in all the places where he'd seen the strong betray the helpless. He reached up, rubbed a hand across his face, and said more to himself than to her. "If this is how your father died, I'll make sure his voice is heard." Emily looked up at him then, the faintest spark of trust flickering in her eyes. She didn't understand everything, but she felt the certainty in his tone, the kind that children recognize before they recognize safety. She reached for her teddy bear, now missing one ear, and hugged it close. Rex lifted his head, his amber eyes following the motion, then rested his chin on his paws again, content only when the girl's breathing had steadied. Outside, the snow thickened, wrapping Silver Creek in a quiet white curtain. Inside the cabin, beneath the hum of the fire, a promise had been made, wordless but unbreakable, between a soldier, a child, and a loyal dog who had once learned to protect life at any cost. Morning in Silver Creek came gray and still, the kind of silence that hangs heavy before something breaks. The fire from the night before had died down to embers, and smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. Jack stood at the window with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, his eyes tracing the thin road that wound down the mountain. Emily was still asleep on the couch, wrapped tightly in the same quilt, her teddy bear beside her, its torn ear stitched roughly back together. Rex lay close, head on his paws, watching her with quiet patience. When Jack finally turned away from the window, his decision was already made. He slipped the small USB into his pocket, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. It was time to bring it to someone who could turn truth into justice. Clara Monroe's office sat on the corner of Main Street, squeezed between the post office and an old cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and winter bread. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed behind thin glasses, her dark hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. Known around town as the only lawyer who still took cases for people without power or money, Clara carried the air of a woman who had seen too many lies dressed in paperwork. When Jack entered her office, the floor creaked beneath his boots, and she looked up from a pile of case files. "Jack Carter," she said, her tone cautious but curious. "It's been a while." He placed the USB on her desk without preamble. "Listen to this." Her brow furrowed, but she plugged it in without hesitation, and as the recording played, Richard's weary voice, Marilyn's cold whisper. The air in the room seemed to freeze. When the audio ended, Clara leaned back, her hand over her mouth. "That's deliberate poisoning," she said finally, her tone low. "And if the timestamps are real, they were planning it while he was still under treatment." Jack nodded once. He died thinking it was his heart. Clara removed her glasses, cleaning them slowly. They wanted his property, his account, the house. That's the oldest story in this town. Greed wearing grief as perfume. She opened a drawer, took out a legal pad, and began writing. "I'll file for authentication of the audio first. Then we go to the sheriff's office. You'll need someone official on your side." Jack hesitated. "Luke's still sheriff here," he said quietly. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Your brother?" He gave a short nod. "He'll listen." By afternoon, the road to the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department was buried in thin fog. The brick building stood like a relic from a better decade, its flag whipping weakly in the cold wind. Inside, Sheriff Luke Carter, 5 years younger than Jack, clean-cut, steady gaze, looked up from his desk as his brother entered, Their handshake was firm but heavy with unspoken history. "You never bring good news," Luke muttered, half a smile touching his lips. Jack slid the USB across the table. "This one's worse than most." They listened together in silence, the recording playing through the room like a ghost returned to accuse the living. When it ended, Luke exhaled. "That's murder. Premeditated." Jack nodded. "And the girl's stepmother and her friend did it to take everything." Luke sat back, folding his arms. "I'll reopen Richard Collins's file, quietly at first. We'll start with tox reports and pharmacy records. But Jack," he paused, "you realize you're stepping right into their spotlight." He wasn't wrong. By the time the sun went down, a new post had begun circulating online, a photo of Emily taken from the funeral, paired with words that made Jack's jaw tighten. Missing child, possible abduction, reward offered. Beneath it, another headline: Veteran involved in disappearance of local girl. Marilyn's face appeared on a news clip that evening, crocodile tears shining under soft lighting as she said, "She's my husband's daughter. That man took her away." Victor stood beside her, nodding solemnly. Jack shut the television off before Emily could see it. Outside, the pines groaned under the weight of wind, and the night felt too still. He rubbed his temples, muttering to himself, "They move fast." The next day, Clara arrived at the cabin, coat buttoned tight against the cold. "They're spinning this," she said as soon as Jack opened the door. "We'll counter it with evidence, but it's going to get noisy. You need people who saw what happened." Her tone softened as her gaze fell on Emily, who sat quietly drawing beside the fire. "Does she know?" Jack shook his head. "Not yet. She just wants her father back." Clara nodded, her voice low. "Then let's make sure his name doesn't disappear under lies." That afternoon, they drove back toward Maple Ridge, to the neighborhood where Richard's house still stood. The windows were dark now, the yard empty, but word traveled fast in small towns. By evening, 2 people had come forward, one older, one forgotten. Dorothy Wilson, a woman in her 60s with gray hair tied in a loose bun, opened her door with a wary glance. "I saw what they did," she said quietly, ushering them inside. "That poor child. They turned the hose on her like she was dirt. I should have stopped it." Her eyes welled, and Jack gently shook his head. "You saw. That's enough. Now it counts." Later, near the alley behind the block, they found Frank Miller, a homeless man who slept behind the grocery store, his jacket patched with duct tape, his beard gray and wild. "I heard the girl cry," he rasped, his voice brittle from years of cold nights. "I saw that man, the tall one, Victor, laughing while he sprayed her. Thought about stepping in, but they'd have run me off." He looked at Jack, shame in his eyes. Didn't know someone would actually care after. Clara took both statements. Carefully, her pen moving fast, her face calm, but her jaw tight. "Witnesses help," she said, "but we'll need something harder to shut them up." Jack nodded, thinking of the USB locked in her briefcase. "We already have the truth. Now we make them face it." They parted ways at dusk, and Jack drove back up the road with Emily asleep in the back seat, her head resting against Rex's side. The truck's headlights cut through the fog, sweeping over the pine trunks like ghosts of the forest. The air smelled of wet earth and distance. It was past midnight when the first sign of danger came. The snow had begun again, falling in slow, deliberate flakes. Jack sat at the kitchen table, sorting through documents Clara had left behind, when Rex's head shot up. The dog's ears stiffened, his body tense, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Jack froze, listening. Then he heard it, tires on gravel, a car engine idling just beyond the gate. He stood, grabbed the flashlight from the counter, and stepped toward the window. Outside, through the thin veil of snow, a pair of headlights flickered once, then dimmed. A shadow moved behind the windshield. Jack moved quickly to the door, Rex at his side. The veteran's voice dropped into the tone he had once used in darker places. "Easy, boy." He cracked the door open, scanning the driveway. Nothing but falling snow. Then, a click. The faint sound of a door closing, footsteps crunching in the distance. Rex barked, sharp and fierce, lunging forward until the leash strained. Jack turned the floodlight on, flooding the yard with pale light. For a split second, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. tall, wearing a dark coat, the profile unmistakable even through the haze. Victor. His face flashed in the glare before he ducked away, vanishing into the forest line. Jack's pulse steadied, not from fear, but from clarity. He shut the door, locked it twice, and went straight to the security panel near the counter. The small red light blinked as the camera uploaded footage to the drive. When the first frame appeared on screen, it was all there. The license plate, the outline of Victor's car, the man himself caught in half-light. "You picked the wrong house," Jack muttered, saving the file. Rex sat beside him, tail thumping once, low and confident. The storm outside thickened, sealing them inside a ring of cold silence. Jack stood for a long moment by the fire, looking at the sleeping child in the corner and then at the USB still glinting faintly on the table. The pieces were coming together, but so were the dangers. He rested a hand on Rex's head, feeling the steady warmth of loyalty that never wavered. "We're not done yet," he said softly. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, eyes glowing amber in the dim light, and the cabin returned to silence, the kind of silence that comes before truth demands to be heard. Snow fell over Maple Ridge that morning, slow and deliberate, blanketing the courthouse steps in silence. The building stood like a monument to old justice, brick, solemn, and unmoved by the years. Jack Carter stood outside the doors, his coat buttoned to the collar, snow collecting on his shoulders. Inside, the murmur of voices drifted through the corridors, the mix of reporters, townsfolk, and officials, all drawn by the story that had shaken the quiet town. Emily sat beside him on a wooden bench, legs swinging slightly above the floor, her metal prosthetic glinting faintly beneath her wool dress. Rex waited near the entrance, lying obediently by the door, his black and tan fur a sharp contrast against the marble floor. When the clerk finally called their names, Jack rose, his face steady, and led the child into the courtroom where truth and betrayal were about to meet. The courtroom of Maple Ridge was modest, tall windows, faded flags, and the echo of shoes on wooden floors. At the center sat Judge Harold Mason, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes, but a voice that could silence any room. The air was heavy with anticipation. Marilyn entered first, dressed in black as if mourning the very decency she'd already buried, her expression carefully painted with grief. Victor followed, tall and stone-faced, his expensive suit unable to hide the restlessness in his hands. Across from them, Clara Monroe arranged her papers with the calm precision of someone who trusted evidence more than emotion. Jack took his seat beside her, his posture straight, eyes fixed forward. Emily sat quietly near the front, her teddy bear in her lap, the faint hum of whispering filling the room like a restless wind. The prosecutor began with the facts: Richard Collins's sudden death, the questionable medication changes, and the unexplained financial transfers to Marilyn's private account. Then came the examination report, traces of toxins found in the remnants of Richard's prescribed pills. "The medication was replaced," the prosecutor said, voice echoing under the high ceiling, "and the dosage increased to lethal levels under the care of the defendants." The murmurs grew louder. Marilyn's fingers twisted in her lap, but her eyes stayed dry. Victor's jaw clenched. When the recording from the USB was played, Richard's voice filled the courtroom, weary, faltering, followed by Marilyn's whisper, too calm to be innocent. The silence that followed was almost reverent, broken only by the rustle of papers and the steady breath of justice gathering its weight. Clara rose next. Her tone was measured, clear. "The evidence speaks for itself," she began, "but there's more." She nodded toward Jack, who walked to the stand with a quiet confidence that turned heads. He placed a small flash drive on the table before the judge. "This," he said, "is footage from my security camera at Silver Creek. It was recorded the same night. False reports claimed I abducted the child sitting there." The screen flickered to life, showing a snowy yard lit by a floodlight. Rex appeared first, barking sharply toward the darkness, then the headlights, and Victor's car pulling into frame. The figure of Victor himself stepped briefly into the light, his face clear, before turning and retreating into the woods. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "This video," Clara continued, her voice firm, "proves not only that the defendants spread false accusations, but that they also followed and attempted to intimidate key witnesses, an act of obstruction." She turned to Victor. "You weren't looking for a child. You were looking to destroy evidence. The prosecutor nodded, confirming the timestamps matched the online posts of the fabricated abduction story. The judge leaned forward, studying the paused frame on the screen. Victor's face caught in a glare, the dog's eyes gleaming behind him, frozen in that moment between guilt and exposure. "Enter it into record," Judge Mason said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Dorothy Wilson was called next. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as she took her oath. "I saw them," she said, her voice wavering but firm. "They dragged that little girl outside and turned the hose on her. I heard them talking about some special medicine for her father, something that would help him sleep longer. I didn't understand then, but I do now." She pressed a tissue to her eyes, tears falling quietly. Clara offered a small nod of reassurance. The room was still. Even Marilyn's confidence began to crack, her painted calm faltering as the words struck deeper than any accusation. Then came Frank Miller, his clothes cleaner than usual, but his demeanor the same, rough, honest, unshakably human. "I was behind the grocery that night," he said, his voice gravelly. "Heard Victor laughing, telling someone that old Collins wouldn't be around much longer. Didn't think anyone would believe me back then." He shifted, uncomfortable under the lights. "Guess I should have spoken sooner." The judge gave a faint nod of acknowledgement. Sometimes truth needed a long road to find its way home. When the witnesses were done, the courtroom sat in heavy quiet. The judge turned toward the prosecution, then the defense. Marilyn's lawyer rose to speak, but faltered under the weight of what had already been shown. The evidence no longer needed interpretation. It spoke with the clarity of conscience. Jack looked toward Emily, who clutched her bear, unaware that the air around her was thick with the closing of a cruel chapter. Then the judge asked the final question that would linger in the air. "Would the child like to say anything?" Clara turned, her voice gentle. "Only if she wants to." Emily hesitated, her small hands tightening around the bear. Then she stood, her tiny frame barely visible. Behind the railing, her voice was soft but unwavering. "If they loved me," she said, "they wouldn't have sprayed water on me." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, rippling outward until they reached every corner of the room. Even the reporters stopped writing. Judge Mason looked down for a long moment before lifting his gavel. "That will be enough," he said quietly. When he spoke again, his tone carried the weight of something final. "The court finds Marilyn Collins and Victor Hale guilty of premeditated poisoning, child abuse, and financial fraud." The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like thunder. "Both are to be taken into immediate custody pending sentencing." The bailiffs moved forward, and the room erupted in a low murmur as Marilyn's composure collapsed, her painted mask slipping into panic. Victor's defiance melted into silence. In the front row, Clara exhaled, a quiet sigh of justice finally breathing again. The judge turned once more to Jack, his voice gentler now. "Mr. Carter, until permanent guardianship is determined, this court grants you temporary custody of the minor." Jack nodded solemnly. He didn't speak. There was no victory here, only closure carved out of sorrow. Emily turned toward him, her eyes uncertain, searching for reassurance. Jack knelt slightly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." The courtroom emptied slowly, the sound of footsteps echoing through the hall. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless. Rex waited by the doors, tail thumping once as Jack and Emily stepped into the cold. The light caught the frost in her hair as she looked up, the courthouse behind them fading into white. Justice had spoken, not with vengeance, but with truth. And as the veteran, the child, and the dog walked down the steps together, the world seemed, for the first time in a long while, to breathe again. The snow that had once fallen with sorrow now returned softly, almost kindly, blanketing the hills of Silver Creek in quiet peace. Months had passed since the verdict that ended the long shadow over Emily's life. The old Monroe house, once a place of cruelty and greed, now stood transformed under new hands. Its cracked paint had been stripped away, windows mended, and a wooden sign hung gently above the porch. The letters carved by Jack himself read, "Silver Creek Haven." Inside, laughter and small voices had begun to fill the rooms again, the sound of healing echoing where silence once lived. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and hope, a mixture that only comes when people decide to begin again. Jack walked the main hall, his boots clicking softly on the polished wood, stopping to check a row of framed drawings along the wall, pictures made by the children who had found shelter here. Emily's crayon sketch of a man, a dog, and a little girl under falling snow sat at the center, slightly crooked but full of warmth. In the corner of the living room, Dorothy Wilson helped a boy patch his torn coat, her gentle hands steady despite her age. Frank Miller stacked boxes of donated blankets near the stairs, his once weathered face carrying something like purpose. And Clara Monroe, still in her winter coat, held a clipboard, marking names and making sure every bed had clean sheets. For the first time in years, the people of Maple Ridge had built something not out of guilt or charity, but out of shared redemption. Outside, Rex ran across the snowy yard, his paws leaving neat prints behind him. The 6-year-old German shepherd had found his new calling. No longer just a guardian, he had become a silent healer. Children who feared touch now reached for his fur, their fingers buried in warmth they could trust. In the mornings, he sat beside Emily during her therapy walks, matching her slow steps as she learned to move with her prosthetic leg more confidently. Jack stood nearby, watching from the porch, the sunlight catching on his dog tags and turning them to silver sparks. Each small step Emily took was a victory, not for speed, but for courage. "Good job, kiddo," Jack would say quietly as she reached the end of the path. Emily would smile, her cheeks red from the cold. "He walks slower when I get tired," she said once, patting Rex's head. Jack chuckled. "That's his way of saying he's proud." It became a daily ritual. Each morning, girl and dog moving side by side through the crisp air, the rhythm of trust guiding them more than words ever could. The locals had begun to notice too. Farmers stopped by with food for the center, teachers offered to tutor the children in the evenings, and an old carpenter volunteered to build new furniture for the rooms. What had begun as an act of protection had grown into a community reborn. As the year drew toward its close, Silver Creek dressed itself for Christmas. Strings of warm yellow lights hung from the eaves, and a tall pine tree stood in the living room, decorated with ribbons made by the children. Emily helped hang the final ornament, a small star carved from wood, at the tree's base where she could reach it. Jack watched from across the room, a faint smile softening the rugged lines of his face. Later that night, as snow whispered against the windows, Emily sat by the fireplace with her teddy bear on her lap. The bear had been cleaned, repaired, and loved again, but something inside it still rattled faintly when she moved it. Curious, she pressed along the seams, fingers tracing the ear that had once held the secret of her father's voice. Instead of the USB, there was now a small folded note tucked deep within the lining. She looked up at Jack, who nodded gently. "It was there all along," he said quietly. With trembling hands, Emily unfolded the paper. Her father's handwriting curved softly across the page, faded but clear. "If you're reading this, it means you've met someone good. Trust them. Even when the world grows dark, hold on to your light, even if all you have left is a single candle." Her lips parted in a soft breath, and her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of understanding. Jack reached over, his calloused hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Christmas morning arrived, wrapped in sunlight and frost. The children of Silver Creek Haven gathered around the big table, their laughter mingling with the smell of freshly baked bread. Clara handed out small gifts donated by townsfolk, scarves, mittens, handmade toys. Dorothy read aloud a prayer of thanks, her voice steady and full of warmth. Frank ladled soup into bowls, humming under his breath. Emily sat between Jack and Rex, her new purple scarf tucked around her neck, the letter from her father folded neatly in her pocket. For the first time, she didn't look away when someone wished her Merry Christmas. She looked up, smiled, and said it back. Weeks later, the official news came from the courthouse. The sentencing was complete. Marilyn Collins and Victor Hale received long prison terms for poisoning, abuse, and fraud. The judge's order restored Richard Collins's estate and assets under Jack Carter's guardianship, with Emily as the rightful heir. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived, quiet, resolute, and fair. When Clara read the document aloud, Emily only nodded once and said, "Then Daddy can rest now." Jack looked at her, pride and sadness mingling behind his steady gaze. There were no cheers, no celebration, just a shared moment of peace among those who had fought for it. Spring thawed the last of the snow by the time Silver Creek Haven held its official opening ceremony. The house gleamed under a soft sun, its white shutters bright and welcoming. A small crowd gathered, townspeople, volunteers, children, and Jack stood before them, his hands folded behind his back, his olive jacket pressed clean. "Family," he said, his voice calm but deep, "isn't made of blood or names on paper. It's made of kindness, of what we choose to give to one another." His words carried across the yard, where the flag of the new center fluttered in the breeze. Dorothy dabbed her eyes, Frank grinned through his beard, and Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glassy with pride. Emily stood beside Jack, wearing a lavender dress and a matching wool scarf, her metal leg gleaming faintly in the sunlight. She held Rex's leash with one hand and looked up at Jack with a shy but certain smile. "Can I call you Dad now?" she asked quietly. Jack turned toward her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small, unguarded smile. "From now on," he said, "you never have to be afraid again." Rex barked once, short, sharp, joyful, and the crowd laughed softly. As dusk fell, the lights of Silver Creek Haven glowed like lanterns across the hillside. Inside, the laughter of children mixed with the low hum of a distant hymn playing on the radio. Jack stood at the window, his silhouette framed by the soft firelight. Behind him, Emily and Rex lay asleep near the hearth, a girl, a dog, and a second chance at family. The world outside was still cold, but inside, warmth had found a home again. And sometimes, that was all the light a person needed to start over. Sometimes, the quietest stories leave the deepest mark. Somewhere out there, people like Jack still choose kindness over comfort, and hearts like Emily's keep believing in the good that remains. Not every act of courage is loud, and not every hero wears a uniform. Some simply stay, protect, and love when no one is watching. Maybe that's what keeps the world from falling apart, those small, unseen sacrifices made in silence. If this story has touched something in you, take a moment to share your thoughts below, or pass it on to someone who needs a little light tonight. And if you believe that compassion still matters, subscribe and stay with us, because kindness, in the end, is the only legacy worth leaving. May God bless you wherever you are.